So this is from round 2 of the recent tournament that happened in Delhi. I was playing white against my opponent, who was a full 550 points higher rated than me. A very daunting prospect to start with. I opened 1 e4. My opponent replied c5, knight f3, a6. Now this is already an unusual move. One of the concepts in chess is in the beginning you try to fight for the center the way I'm doing. I'm putting a pawn in the middle, I'm putting my knight facing the middle, and my opponent here on the second move is already playing a very rare sideline, a6. I decide to sort of steer the game into a position that I'm familiar with, so I go d4, he takes, I take back with my knight, and he goes knight f6. This again seems provocative. He's putting his knight in the middle where it could possibly be attacked by this pawn move, but there's a tactic here that actually means this would be somewhat in my opponent's favor. He would play the move queen a5 check, and whatever I do, he would take this pawn and be a pawn up. So I just protect my pawn on e4, and now he plays e5. My opponent plays the best move d5, and it exposes why the move that I made was a mistake. So what's the point of d5? Well, let's say I go ed5, my knight drops, that's no good. Let's say I take this pawn off, he takes back, and whichever way I capture, if it's with the pawn, again I lose a piece. If it's with my queen, then he trades, and once again my opponent goes up a piece. Therefore, after d5, I play the only move in the position that keeps me in the game, knight g3. My opponent advances even further now, kicking my knight back, and I put it on e2. He develops with knight c6, and I challenge his strong center that he's already managed to get with c3. He protects that center with bishop c5, in the meanwhile also developing his king side. I trade, he takes, I take again, he takes back. Notice how I'm making these moves because I realize that I'm already worse in this position, so I should try to trade off pieces and play for equality rather than anything else. And also it sort of releases the cramp in my position. My bishop can now come out from f1. I put my bishop on e2 hoping to castle. My opponent now plays queen a5 check. I block with bishop d2, and he puts his queen on b6, which is a good move. He's attacking two pawns now at once. He's attacking the pawn on b2, and he's also attacking the pawn on f2. I'm going to lose one of these pawns, so I decide in this position to castle, and my opponent now can take this pawn on b2 with his queen. If he had taken with his bishop, then he's asking, well, he's making life difficult for himself with rook b1, because that would go into a pin, and you have to now look for ways to release himself from that pin. Set queen b2, and I decide in this position I'm a pawn down. My opponent's pieces are already placed better than mine. If I just simply try and defend my position, it might go closer and closer to an endgame where my opponent just presses on with the advantage he has. So I decide to give up a second pawn for compensation. My opponent accepts it, and I go bishop b4. By placing my bishop on this diagonal, it means he cannot castle on the king side because the bishop controls the f8 square. And that's what I'm really playing on, that his king is in the middle for the time being, and that could give me some chances. He goes bishop e6, perhaps thinking about castling queen side. I jump in with my knight. and this has a few threats. I'm threatening to take on d4, I'm threatening to go knight d6 check, I'm threatening to take on g7 with check. So my opponent takes this off and puts his queen back onto d5, centralizing it. I now want to keep the pressure on my opponent, so I play this move, bishop f3. It's definitely not the best move in the position. My opponent goes e4. I pin the pawn to his king with my rook, but my opponent in this position decides to castle, getting out of that pin and now threatening my bishop. In this position I go rook e2, which is a mistake. Why is it a mistake? My opponent in this position has this forcing sequence: bishop f2 check. I would take the bishop, queen f5 check, and that move creates this discovered attack on my queen on d1. So wherever I move next, my queen is lost and my opponent has a winning position. Thankfully, my opponent did not find that. I think he was feeling a little nervous here with his king sort of exposed, and was thinking more about protecting that. So he plays the move rook d7, and I now develop my queen to a4 and am looking to move my pieces to the queen side to attack his king. He plays rook c7, again being protective. I attack that rook with my bishop. My opponent goes b5. Queen a3, queen c5, offering a queen exchange. I of course reject that. If I exchange queens, I'm simply down 2 pawns and will quite easily lose this position. Queen a7, and now rook c1. My opponent plays knight d5, protecting his rook. I once again hit the rook, bringing my bishop to d6. My opponent in this position takes the third pawn. He's now up 3 pawns by taking on f2 with check. I play king h1. He trades on c1 and places his king on d7. He's hoping to develop his rook, and well, if he can manage to develop his rook and put his king towards the king side, then he might simply have a winning position. I play bishop e5, and I'm looking to get in with my queen onto d6. My opponent here plays b4, which is a blunder. I go queen a4 check, which is a good move but not the best move. Queen b3 here, for example, which hits the knight, and if the knight moves, is hitting the pawn behind him. So for example, some move like knight c3 would, I could go queen f7 check, although again that's not the strongest move in the position. So in this position my opponent might have tried to protect the knight, but I would have gone rook d1, and well, the knight's just lost. Anyway, that didn't happen. I played queen a4 check. He played his king to e8, and here I played a definite, you could even call it a blunder, queen c6. I played this because I wanted to get my queen in on the action. I'm still threatening to check on d6, but this can be refuted. I was also trying to play my moves quickly. I was noticing that my opponent was in deep time trouble. He in this position probably had some 10 minutes or less left on his clock, whereas I had maybe 40 minutes. And well, this was just keeping up the pressures. My opponent did find the best move, developed his rook, protecting his knight, protecting d6 as well. I took the pawn on g7, now threatening to play f6. My opponent in this position actually lost on time. He tried to play queen d7, but before he could press the clock, he had already flagged. It was just to show you what could have happened in this position. This is actually still a blunder by my opponent. I could have gone f6. He would have gone king e8 only move. I would have taken this pawn on a6 and threatening to play my bishop to b5, pinning his queen to his king and therefore winning. If he had played knight c7, I would have taken that off. When he would have taken, I would have played bishop b5. He would have to protect that, or block that with his rook. I would play this check. He would have blocked that with his queen, and I would play queen e4 check, only move queen e7, and a nice checkmate. Notice that the rook cannot take back because of the pin by the bishop.